So now that we've introduced a bit of game theory, let's look at some mechanisms that matter in our context. And these are typically things you would find in an introductory economics book. There's a lot of material here. We obviously can't cover all of it right now, but we'll take a look at some that you might encounter in a DeFi setting. So the first one we're looking at is auctions. And why is it interesting? Auctions is a mechanism that you can use to do a bunch of things. First off, well, the typical thing is it brings together people who want to buy or sell things. And one interesting aspect of this is in comparison to, for instance, going to a shop, you would, at an auction, you don't know the price in advance. So you go to a shop and you see, for instance, you want to buy a book and the book costs, let's say, $15. So the price is set. Now at an auction, you're selling something that doesn't have a price yet. And that makes it interesting because you have a bunch of people coming together to essentially not only set what the price is, but also determine who gets to buy this. And there's a few typical mechanisms to look at. First off, one dimension to look at is if everybody can see the bids. So if everyone can see the bids, this is like the typical auction you would see in a movie where, for instance, they're bidding for a painting. And then like the first person says, I don't know, I bid $100. Then the next person says, I bid 105. And so on. So everybody knows what the current price is. This is what we call an open bid auction. In contrast to that, there is also a sealed bid auction where everybody essentially seals it. So like one way would be to write it on a paper, and then you write all the bids on the paper and then hand them in, and then there's a mechanism to determine what the best bid is. Now, for the person bidding, there's an interesting question to ask for themselves. What is the optimal bid? So and the interesting part is so essentially you might you don't want to overpay, you don't want but you don't want to lose out on the item. So these are two aspects that you might look at. So you know what price you personally are willing to pay. But also if let's say to you something might be worth $100 and everybody else might value it at $50, you might not feel too good paying the $100, especially if you come out at the end of the auction and then it might have been a sealed bid auction, and then all the bids are revealed, and then you figure out you paid like more than double or a way higher amount than everybody else would have wanted to pay. So this is sort of an imbalance that a mechanism can solve. And the interesting part is, so one mechanism to solve this would be an open bid auction. Typical one is an ascending one, so the price goes up. You start at a smaller price and then keep going up. In such an auction, there is one big drawback. So again, if you might have seen this in the movies or taken part in one of these auctions, you'll realize it takes a lot of time. So if you want to sell a bunch of things, you might end up just having like the cost of selling these things just goes up because it takes so much time to complete the biddings. Especially if there might happen some sort of like a battle between the bidders and so on. There is a solution to that in the open bid setting, and this would be a descending auction, what we call a Dutch auction, and it's very fast, and typically it has been used, if I'm not mistaken, in like fruit markets and things like that, where wholesalers would buy and sell their goods in bulk, but at a high speed. So the way it works is you start out with the maximum price, and compared to the ascending auction, where you can change the bid, like let's say in the ascending auction, let's say you want to buy a bag of potatoes. In the ascending auction, you would, like, the first bid might be $2 and the next bid might be $3. Then if you bid $2, you can increase that bid over time. And if somebody comes with $3, you can say, oh no, I bid $3.50. And then you have a second chance at winning this auction. Now with the Dutch auction, the first person to make a bid wins. So you start out, let's say for the bag of potatoes, you would start with $20, and then you have a clock that goes down, and then before the clock reaches 0 or the end time, you have the chance to make your bid, and the bid goes down over time, and the first person to sort of make this bid or trigger gets it. So the mechanism that works is that you would sort of increase this sense of scarcity, because once the bid is gone, it's gone. So that's also one way, but it also has some drawbacks. Like you need to start out with a maximum price, so you would never go over. It's impossible in this mechanism to go over that price, which might not be in the interest of the seller. Probably so you need to already know approximately what price range would be interesting. Now, sealed bid options are different in that sense, so you don't see what the bid is, and they have one more interesting aspect. Because it's a sealed bid auction, you don't need to physically conduct the auction at the same time. You could you just need to make one single bid, and this is the maximum you're willing to pay. Now, this has one big advantage, that you don't have to have this mechanism where there's a countdown or whatever. You just say, okay, this is the end date. Until this end date, we accept bids, and once this end date is reached, the winner will be determined, and that is it. This is also particularly interesting in a DeFi setting because it's just much more complicated to make these bids with this timer, and maybe not everybody has time at the same moment where the auction should happen. So a sealed bid auction might be interesting. And now there's two types we can go, or two typical types. One is essentially they're different in what the price is going to be. The first one is a first price, and the second one is a second price, also known as a victory auction. And the first price auction just means that the highest bid, so let's say we're bidding for some good, let's say again a painting, we're bidding for this painting, and the highest bid wins. Now the second price auction lets the second highest bid win. And the interesting thing is, why would you want to do that? And the great aspect about this is that the first price auction might lead to you wanting to strategically bid. So you might not say what your actual maximum willingness to pay is. And this is something what we call that it's not incentive compatible. So incentive compatible would be an auction where you where the mechanism encourages you, or it's the best strategy for you to bid what you actually value this good to be. Now with let me explain what the reason for this is. If you're going to so you have this one chance to bid, and the winning of the bid and the price of the bid are tied to each other. So let's say you bid $100, and these $100, irrespective of what everybody else bids, is going to be the winning bid. So you might want to think strategically about this and say you have an impression that everybody else might bid lower than you, then you might bid lower than what your maximum willingness to pay is. So this leads to this issue that you're trying to sort of strategically be smarter than the system. Now the second price auction circumvents this problem, because it's still the person who is willing to pay the most who gets who wins this auction, but it's the price of the second highest bid which is the price that the first person was going to pay. And this is it has a very beautiful solution to this situation, because you will so first case, you won't overbid, obviously, because you don't want to make a bid or you don't want to end up paying more than you're willing to pay for this good. So let's say you are willing to pay $100, you won't bid $110 just to win the auction, because if you win, you might have to pay $110 or you might have to pay $90. You don't know, but you might end up with something that's over the $100. Now, you also don't want to underbid, because if you know that you don't need to pay the highest price, you would only risk losing the auction if you bid lower than you would actually want to bid. And yeah, I think that's an interesting mechanism to use in such a setting that you might want to incorporate. There's, of course, way more complex ways to look at this. There's a whole field of economics looking into this topic, which is auction theory, and it probably makes sense if you're going to build a system to know a few more mechanisms. But I think knowing the second price sealed bid auction, knowing the Dutch auction, that's the open bid descending auction, will give you a bit of a start. And from there, you can make variations of these. For instance, you could make several rounds of auctions. You can think of a lot of things like very prominent auctions that you might encounter in real life are there's obviously eBay. There's the ad auctions that you might encounter if you use products like Google advertising or Facebook or Instagram advertising. And there's also one of the auctions that essentially determine how good your phone reception and how expensive it is to have a mobile phone. The frequencies are typically sold via an auction, and if I remember correctly, this year's economics Nobel Prize was awarded to one of these auctions. Yeah. So we've encountered auctions. Let's continue with another typical topic in economics, which is something we call supply and demand. And so the supply and demand, it's a very simple concept. We essentially look at a certain good. It could be, again, like let's say it's our potatoes, or it could be for a currency, let's say for Ethereum. Anything you want. Supply and demand essentially looks at a curve of price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. So we're looking at the relationship between price and quantity of a good. And we can draw two curves. One is a demand curve, which starts on the top left and ends in the bottom right. And a supply curve, which starts on the bottom left and ends on the top right. Now, what does that mean? So if we look at the supply curve, we can think of it as a setting where all the suppliers in the market, this could be through an auction, this could be in retail stores, in any place they want to sell. It just shows everybody who's willing to supply this certain good, for instance, the potatoes. You might find, intuitively, you might find a small quantity that is willing to be sold at a low price, and an ever higher quantity that is willing to be sold at a higher price. So let's say this bag of potatoes, you might find a single person who might be willing to sell like one bag, two bags for $5, but you would find hundreds of people willing to sell this good for $100. Now, the demand curve is the opposite. If we look at the demand, you're going to find a bunch of people who are willing to buy this good at a low price. So you would find hundreds of people willing to buy this bag of potatoes at $5, and you would find very few people willing to buy it at $100. And somewhere in between these meet, and this is what we call the market clearing price and quantity. So let's say at $30 for this bag of potatoes, everybody's happy, and this is what the price will be at the end. And it's sort of like this imaginary concept. It doesn't necessarily have to reflect. It won't immediately show an effect, but it's more like the result that you might see out of this economic behavior as a concept. So think of it this way: you go to the store and you want to buy potatoes, and they might have set the price too high. So let's say they set the price at $40. So and by the way, I'm using these completely absurd numbers. They're just examples. So let's say the bag costs $40, so nobody's going to buy it. So the store sees, okay, their potatoes are just rotting there because nobody's buying it. So the next day they decide to lower the price and they sell them for, let's say, $35, and they still see that they could sell more. Now at some point they lower it even further and further, and at some point they might overshoot. They lower it to $5. So not everybody's coming to the store and trying to buy potatoes. And this obviously triggers the store to increase the price and be able to charge more for this. And so this is basically this concept. And the interesting thing is these curves might shift over time. So you might have a demand curve that starts at a certain setting, and then if people get more optimistic about consumption, so let's say there might be a COVID vaccine, so people start spending more and have more income, you would see the demand curve shift to the right because people are willing to buy higher quantities with at a higher price. So at the end of the day, both price and quantity go up. So this is something to look out for. There's also a concept of elasticity of these curves. We won't go into that too much. It's essentially about how much people are willing to shift their demand or supply if the price shifts. So let's say somebody is in desperate need of something. They might be willing to buy the same quantity for any price the supplier might want to charge. Yes, and then there is one thing that comes very close to this demand curve in real life, and this is what we call the order book. And this is how typically exchanges work. And we've displayed one on the right side of the slide. Essentially, what you see there is people giving in their orders, and these orders would be either buy orders or sell orders. And the way the exchanges work in different ways. So, for instance, you could have something called a market order or a limit order. Market order would say just buy it at the current closing price. Or the limit order would be saying, I'm willing to buy a certain quantity or sell a certain quantity up to a certain price. And this is essentially how buyers and sellers in big markets might be matched. So this could be, for instance, for cryptocurrency. This could be for buying equity. It could also be for buying commodities, anything you might want to buy at an exchange. And the details of these mechanisms are important to determine what people are bidding and how the market moves. So let's continue with another concept called interest rates and the market for investments. An interest rate is pretty simple. So somebody bought, there you have two sides, one person lending and one person borrowing money. And so essentially you give this certain amount of money, and in return you get the money back plus an amount of interest, and the interest rate is the amount you pay for that over a period. And the drawing the chart we have on the left hand side is something we call the yield curve, and it shows how over time. So if you borrow very short term, as you see on the left side, or further left, you see it's somewhere around 1.52 and so on. By the way, I believe this is an older image. Now the interest rates are much lower, but what you would see is the interest rate is lower if you have a more short-term product, and the longer term it goes, the higher the interest goes. And why are we talking about market for investments? There's essentially different investors want to invest different quantities and over different time periods, and they might be willing to pay or accept different terms for that. And this is something that is determined on a market via supply and demand, as we've seen on the previous page, but also controlled by an entity called central banks. And we're looking at this topic because this is also one of the things you would typically encounter in a DeFi setting. So let's continue on the next slide with interest rates and the market for investments again, and look at what the central bank might do. And here we have a chart of the bank rate of the Bank of England. And so the Bank of England is the central bank in the UK, and what they do is they influence the market using this concept of the bank rate. And essentially this is an instrument, what we call monetary policy, and they have certain goals in the Bank of England. For instance, they want to promote price stability, or they might want to reduce unemployment. And in order to do so, they can use certain operations. For instance, they can change the interest rate that they offer to banks that deposit money with them. And this leads, this sort of sets a baseline of that the banks can use when working with customers. So let's say the bank rate might be very low. So this might promote banks to give out more loans and the population to save less, because if the bank rate is low, the banks can't give such a high interest rate to customers, and for customers it might be more interesting to consume rather than save. If it goes higher, this might have the opposite effect. Now, this might lead to issues at some point, because you can have a negative interest rate, but you can't sustain that for very long, because banks will pass that on to their consumers, which might have some other effects. There's also something called open market operations. So you could, for instance, influence the money supply, for instance, by purchasing government bonds. So essentially you're giving more money to the government, so there's more money in circulation in the whole system. Which also has a bunch of effects. And finally, there's regulatory activity that these central banks can do. And during this course, so during the rest of the lecture, we're going to look at some of these operations that not only a central bank can do, but people creating DeFi products can think about and can solve within their products, and work with in a way that is interesting for all the sides that come together in this product. So for instance, if your mechanism involves lending, you need to consider that this will lead to a certain market in this space. If your market is, or if your product involves, for instance, having certain tokens issued, you might consider the quantity of tokens available will drive some of the behaviors of the actors. So these are some of the areas to think about, and we will introduce some examples over the course of this lecture. So stay tuned.